Well, welcome back, and welcome to newcomers to my class. This should be a good one. Welcome to those of you who are here on Zoom, Ronald, and whomever else is out there. Thank you, William. Thank you for being involved. Please stay involved. If you have any questions, you can either punch up the question, and Trina will let me know, that there is one. So please feel free to become involved and stay involved in the class. This class we're going to talk about what I call inside the Confederate government. You talk a lot about the Lincoln administration and talk about Jeff Davis and the armies and General Lee and everything, but what we really don't get into, at least I never really did to any terrific extent, was the internal workings of the government in Richmond. What really made them, what was their motivation? What were they doing? What were they thinking during the war? And before the war as well. What they were thinking after the war, they were no longer the Confederate government, so we don't have much to work with. The point is that a good analysis of the Confederate government, the people, where they came from, and their origins, the type of people that they were, and the interests that they represented are an integral part of the whole story of the Confederacy. And I think it bears study. I think that you'll walk away from this class, I hope anyway, with a better perspective of how the government pushed the 4-year experience, 4-year Confederate enterprise. Interestingly, I know, starting in 1814 with the Hartford Convention in Hartford, Connecticut, there was talk of secession. At that point, there were some northern states, Massachusetts, New England states, who felt like the War of 1812 and what was following was detrimental to them. And so those states hinted at secession from the United States of America. And that might be what gave rise to John C. Calhoun's use of that kind of talk in the years that followed. Can you all hear me? Okay. So secession had been part of the American story for longer than the 1820s and 1830s, and that which led up to the secession of the southern states. But nonetheless, that's where it started, and that needs to be recognized. John C. Calhoun, who was Vice President of the United States under Andrew Jackson, decided that he was going to lead South Carolina to nullify federal law during the Jackson administration. That was the first step that of course, many southern states disqualified that and would not support it. But that was another step in the direction of rethinking the United States of America, when they put it before the Civil War. It was not the United States. There was slightly different terminology. But the fact is that there had been talk in 1850, the compromise, the Nashville compromise of 1850, which allowed for the 3630, the Kansas-Nebraska delineation of what slavery, the slave states, what line would be the demarcation between the slave states and free states. And of course, the fugitive slave law came into existence at that point. as a compromise that the southern states would not secede. And that was the last hurrah of John C. Calhoun. And he passed away, not long thereafter. But again, the talk of secession over the issue of slavery was deeply ingrained in the United States government. From the president on down, everyone was involved in that debate on one side or another. But as the 1850s went on, the issue of slavery became more and more obtuse to people. There was the violence in the Senate with Senator Sumner and Butler from South Carolina. And it all culminated, of course, with the election of 1860, with Lincoln being basically a minority candidate from just a regional candidate from basically from the North, and virtually no support anywhere in the South, becoming president of the United States. And this became a rallying cry. Certainly not every southern state was anxious to create a separate government. But there were 13 slave states that had an axe to grind and that had, strong interest in this issue and what to do about it. Some states felt that it was time, just the fact that Abraham Lincoln was elected, was he an abolitionist or wasn't he? Did he intend to impose his will on the southern states? Because a lot of Southerners felt like the U.S. Constitution protects slavery, and some felt that it didn't matter. That the fact is that Lincoln would use his government power to intimidate or otherwise. The word is to force the issue of abolitionism on the slave states. And as a result, there was a fairly immediate reaction. We know that with the November 1860 election, starting in December, by December 10th, 1860, South Carolina had met in its legislature and decided that it was going to secede. And it did. And because of the influence of the Charleston Mercury and what was known as the fire eaters, we all familiar with the fire eaters. The fire eaters were that portion of the influential Southern politicians who were absolutely for secession and forming a separate country. They were fire eaters before Lincoln. Lincoln pushed them over the edge. In South Carolina, which was the foremost conglomeration of fire eaters in the South, there was enough push and there was enough power of this group of fire eaters in the state of South Carolina to where they could essentially push the issue through, convene the state legislature, create an act of secession, and secession documents, and pass secession within the state of South Carolina. And they did. And it was December 10th, 1860. And the famous, if you read much about the Civil War, you'll always see that famous declaration by the Charleston Mercury. The Union is dissolved. Big, bold, black letters for their edition that day. And as a result, during the next 2 months, 2.5 months, 6 other Deep South Confederate states finally also joined South Carolina, and they officially seceded from the Union from their standpoint. Lincoln, of course, in those days didn't become the president, didn't get sworn in until March of 1861. So this was before Lincoln. And the idea was to try to get as much organization built before Lincoln even took office, to try and get as much pull as they possibly could to be organized by the time Lincoln could begin to impose his will on the South. And so the Deep South, South Carolina, Florida, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, Texas, and Louisiana became the first 7 states. And so they formed a government and they used as their capital Montgomery, Alabama, the Montgomery, Alabama State House before they originally. And what's really interesting to me was just a feeling that I have is that they spent all the fire eaters and the major secessions spent years, decades pushing for secession. And they finally got it. They finally did it. But what became apparent, at least to me, was that they spent most of their time thinking about how to get out of the Union, but not enough time thinking of what they would do after they got out of the Union to start the government. So what they did in Montgomery was they basically took the U.S. Constitution, but if they had a copy of it, they could have just done a couple of changes. The only thing they changed from the U.S. Constitution was 1 6-year term, non-renewable for the president, and a veto, a line-item veto for the president. And those were, of course, the permanent establishment of slavery and the protection of slavery and everything, the requirement of slavery for enslavement of black people. And you had to have slavery or recognize slavery in order to be a Confederate state. Those were the only real changes in the Constitution of the Confederacy. And so I'm not sure what else they could have done or should have done or would have done, but that's what they did. And as a result, there were still 7, 8, 6 slave states that had not joined the Confederacy. And when those states finished, the first 7 finished their process of secession, most of them, created the legislatures created secession documents that made clear the reasons for this secession and the need for a separate country, so to speak. And so it became clear what they were doing. I lived in Georgia for 11 years, so I got to see the Georgia secession documents, read them pretty well. Probably half of the paragraphs in there had to do with slavery. It's pretty clear what the need was, and so Texas is another, Mississippi is another, South Carolina is obvious about what their motivation was in all this. So they got that done, except that it was only halfway done, pretty much. The other 6 states happened to be states that were the most populous states. Virginia, North Carolina were populous states. Maryland, which was a slave state, and Missouri, which had not seceded, they had 2 of the biggest industrial cities in the slave states, and they were pretty badly needed. Yes.
Did the states back then depend on federal funding the way the states do today? Did the states back then depend on federal funding the way the states do?
No, there was no taxation.
Okay.
There was no personal income tax of any kind. And interestingly, southern states had considerably less public works in a lot of northern states, like for example, New York State. They had the Erie Canal that they built. They didn't tax the people of New York for that. They didn't, the people from Mississippi or anywhere else didn't pay into New York for the Erie Canal. That was done that was a state cost, and the states did their own taxation. And so McPherson points out in his book that the Battle Cry of Freedom, that Southerners were among the most lightly taxed people on earth in terms of the federal government. Their complaint about taxation, everybody complains about taxation, whatever it is. Their complaint was that their states were taxing them too much. So everything being relative, of course. But there were some major efforts by southern states to build railroads in the 1850s. There was a big debate going on in the U.S. Congress for 7 or 8 years leading up to the Civil War about what transcontinental railroad would be built to California. Remember, 1849 was the gold rush in California. People wanted to be able to move out there and get out there pretty easily. So the northern people wanted the main rail line to go through the northern states. Southerners wanted the rail line to go from the south so that they could easily transport their slaves on the railroad to get to California to put their slaves to work in the gold mining industry, so they could get rich quick. And that was part of the rub. Northerners didn't want to compete against slaves and slave owners for whatever gold, whatever they could, mine and farm in the West. That was really the rub. And so as a result, all these factors added in to the final decision by the South to just go it alone and try to create their own country. Yes.
Just to go back a step, you were talking about building the railroads, which wound up being important in the Civil War.
Yes.
Were those all built with state money in all the states?
Generally speaking, yeah.
Or was it private?
Oh, it's probably a combination of private money, but those projects were so big that I don't think private money was going to be enough. For example, Baltimore and Ohio Railroad in this state. I'm sure that the state participated in it, but there were some investors that had to been involved at the beginning anyway. The first, you all they would be aware that Maryland that the B&O, when its first tracks they were really still horse drawn. The first stop, the first commuter railroad basically was between Baltimore and Ellicott City. And the old station there is still there in Ellicott City, down at the bottom of the hill. It gets flooded all the time. But the point is that they were originally horse-drawn, and then the steam engines began on a very small level, and they started going west. And by the Civil War, they had fairly well reached Wheeling, West Virginia, on the Ohio River in the state of Virginia. So yes, they were. Some of the southern states had done so. Somehow, in the north, most all of the railroad gauges were the same gauge. In the south, there were different gauges, and that came to play became a problem for southern war transportation. But that's not where I want to go today. But let's talk a little bit about the people. What was going to happen because the Confederate government started with a adversarial, should we call it, adversarial relationship with the Lincoln administration, which was still not in office yet. It had a few important issues that it had to deal with immediately. And that would be raise the army, manage the economy, and control the citizens. The Confederate States of America were founded on the largely on the issue of slavery, but also states' rights. That they felt that the states had the right to withdraw from the United States government at will. But could they afford to drop out of the Confederate government as well? And the answer to that was no. They were not. And as a result, they had their own issue of controlling the citizens. And in the face of a likelihood of aggression by the North, they immediately needed to start to raise an army right from the very outset. In doing so, they had to, the national government had to create a national army, whereas the states themselves just had state militias. When they were part of the United States government, there was a U.S. Army, but that army was, in 1860, the United States Army consisted of 20,000 men, all spread out all over the West, mostly protecting settlers from Native American attacks, et cetera, et cetera. This situation that the Confederacy found itself in right from the start, when they opened the doors, was to create a substantially larger army. And to do so without much in the way of finance was going to be a problem. That was a problem. That turned out to be a huge problem. But also, what they needed was not only the money, but they needed the cooperation of the states. The state legislatures, the state governors, and that was a rub right from the beginning. Because if the states didn't offer their volunteers to the Confederate Army, what power could the Confederacy have to move people where they needed to move soldiers where they needed to move them, when they needed to move them? So that was a big issue right from the beginning. So essentially, war and the upcoming conflict created the necessity for a much stronger centralized government than those southern states were probably prepared to offer. And that was a challenge right from the outset. So it was important that those people who came together originally to begin to chisel out and to create a government, it was important for them to understand the biggest challenges that they had. And generally, I think they did. One of the things that they did was to understand that they just had 7 states and they needed to attract the other slave states into their new confederation. In doing so, they felt that it was important not to put into leadership positions the fire eaters. Fire eaters were basically the worst enemies of the Confederacy because even though they were the most passionate for secession, they were the most aggressive in terms of insisting on reinstatement of the international slave trade, which was a no-no, which would have basically destroyed any potential recognition from Europe right from the outset. Yes,
No, but I do have a question.
yes.
How much time elapsed between the time that the Confederacy was established in the government and Lincoln declared war on them?
Well, they started the government in January. They initially met in Montgomery in January. Lincoln was inaugurated in March 4th, 1861. And they fired on Fort Sumter April 12th, 1861. So
Hardly any time.
hardly any time. What was problematic for them was that Lincoln, in his inauguration and even before his inauguration, repeated time and again that he had no intention to coerce or invade the South or militarily do anything to the South. And I think he understood that unless the South had done something dramatic militarily against the North, that he didn't have the public support anywhere much in the North to invade the South. There were certainly passionate abolitionists in the North, no question. Part of the Republican Party included abolitionism. Abolitionists, the major spokespersons were Republicans. But make no mistake, many Republicans had nothing to do with abolitionists. As a matter of fact, abolitionists had to be careful in the North because they could be attacked, physically attacked. They were very unpopular. They were passionate, and some of them were religious people, but they didn't really have the political power in the North that the centrists did. Remember, in the North, the Democratic Party in the North was mostly pro-slavery. By no means was the entire North abolitionist. There were many pro-slavery Democrats in the North who became what was called Copperheads during the war. They were strongly against abolitionism, and they were fighting the war to keep the nation as one. That was the Stephen Douglas Democratic organization. And so Lincoln himself kept advocating against any coercion against the South, and he even made that very clear in March in his inaugural speech. I've got to quote, but he's, basically it was a question of war is in the hands of my southern, neighbors, and not me, because I will not do anything physically to coerce the South. And that's essentially the main glue that kept those other 6 slave states in the Union in this interim period. Now, what was the job of the initial group that met to form the Confederate government, the representatives of those 7 states? Well, it was to find the right man to be president. That was job 1. And there were numerous people. They had, there was a lot of discussion. There were numerous candidates. Some were fire eaters. Some were strong secessionists. Others were milquetoast secessionists. What were called cooperationists for years prior to secession itself. But they did settle on one man who had a history of fiery speeches warning of secession as a U.S. senator, but who advocated, as long as he felt like he possibly could, for remaining in the Union to allow the United States Constitution to protect slavery. He was a major slave owner in the state of Mississippi, and his brother was the biggest and most powerful, wealthiest slave owner in the state of Mississippi. And so this man finally left Washington regrettably and gave a passionate speech right before he departed, expressing his love of the Union, which I think, had to be fairly unquestionable, and went back home to his Briarfield plantation in Mississippi, not thinking of much about what he would do since the Confederacy and his state had seceded. So Jefferson Davis was picking roses on his plantation when it was announced to him by men who had participated in the initial vote among the representatives in Montgomery, to please come to Montgomery and assume the role of president of the Confederacy. Apparently, he was blanched at the idea. I think he understood how immensely difficult that job would be. He was a government man. He understood the government. He had been in the cabinet of President Franklin Pierce. He had been, a senator for a number of years. Had been through the grind of the Senate, and understood, I suppose, that it's a different story to drop out of the government than to create one. And that's what must have hit him when they decided, because he always suggested that his objective was really not to be the president of the Confederacy. He wanted to be the general-in-chief of the Confederacy, because he had a military background. But he accepted and went to Montgomery and humbly took the job and was inaugurated as president of the Confederacy.
So he was never elected?
No. They had some states did vote, but he was not elected. That was the provisional government. He was elected the next year. They had elections the next year. The provisional government of the Confederacy was appointed essentially by the representatives from the 7 states meeting in Montgomery. Okay. So who was Jefferson Davis? Well, former Secretary of War, longtime Mississippi senator, not a fire eater, but an outspoken secessionist leader. He went to Transylvania College in Kentucky. He was a Kentuckian. Went to Transylvania College, but was unhappy there. And so his father got him an appointment to West Point, where he went and graduated. He wasn't, he had his share of demerits as a cadet at West Point. Had to do with his staunch attitude. He had an attitude, and that attitude was reflected when he was caught at Benny Havens, the bar in the town of West Point, at the point where he was he had his share of beer, and he claimed that beer wasn't liquor or alcohol. And he just staunchly denied, the reality of it. That was, if there was ever an essence of his personality, I'm not, I don't know scientifically, but he was intoxicated, didn't want to acknowledge it, and so that was his way. It sort of like stayed with him. And we'll talk about later about the things that he did that once he latched onto something, he stayed with it. And that would include not so good generals, which overall really hurt the Southern military cause. But the big thing that happened to him was he was a war hero in the Mexican War. No question about it. He led at the Battle of Buena Vista his large company of Mississippi Rifles. At a crucial point during the Battle of Buena Vista, Davis stood firm with his command and defended a certain area from an attack from the Mexican army, and acted with great courage and bravery, and his people were well recognized that. He was well recognized for that. So he did show, tremendous courage and he proved himself in battle. Now, something happened to him though, because what was essentially a small group of men, a large, company with 100 men or so, gave him the feeling that he was really a military genius. And that's why he felt, even with that minimal experience, that he could command, and that was always in the back of his mind. But as a result, he got an awful lot of great recognition as a military guy. And in Mississippi, one of the things that happened, he was engaged after the war. He was engaged to be married to the daughter of former President Zachary Taylor. And this young woman was really nice. They apparently had a wonderful relationship. And as a result of all this, his brother Joseph Davis, who was that wealthiest man in the state of Mississippi, and owned his property at what was called Davis Bend in the Mississippi River, as a reward for his brother, who really wasn't not a wealthy person from Kentucky, essentially gave him Briarfield Plantation as a wedding person to get the marriage started and to get him, set up, in life, because he was already in politics and that was a legitimate, logical way for Joe to promote his own interests, but also to promote his brother. Nothing wrong with that. Really good thing. So that's how he became an established Mississippi planter. So that's the background that we should all have, that we should be aware of. And of course, like most wealthy planters, he expected deference from the people around him. Davis, during his lifetime, was known to have participated in or come close to several duels with different people because of his attitude and expectation of deference. But that's not unique, in the South. But he acted aggressively on behalf of the national government to control affairs previously controlled by the states, stepping into the void. He had the power, the passion as a leader to go where maybe Southern leaders would have tiptoed, he stepped right in because he understood that the Confederate government couldn't survive unless the national government stepped into the breach and largely took control, not only of the armies, but of the laws to put the states in a second-rate position vis-a-vis the federal government, the federal Confederate government. And when you do that right from the outset, there's going to be friction. And the friction quickly was created with the governors. We'll get into how that will eventuate. He had health problems. He had a serious case of malaria in 1836. And in 1858, a serious ocular inflammation that clouded his vision in his left eye. He could barely see, if he could at all, from his left eye. It had a film. And he had dyspepsia condition that likely impacted his personality, made him irritable. It made me irritable too. If I had it, I don't know, but I never think I had dyspepsia. My wife tells me I can become irritable pretty quickly. Georgia Tech is losing, I get very irritable. But the point is that this was Jefferson Davis. He was a completely dedicated person in virtually every way, shape, and form. And one thing I forgot to mention was that when he did get the plantation, prior to the plantation, and he married this tailor, Zachary, the dad, the former president, warned her not to go down to Mississippi during the malaria season. But she went. And within weeks or months, contacted malaria and died. I mean, it created a horrendous relationship between Davis's and Taylor's. And apparently it did have a real impact on him. He eventually remarried, but the point is that that was a huge setback for him personally in his life. Okay, so the new Confederate government now has a president, and that president, among the things he had to do was to appoint a cabinet. And it was really important because knowing that the likelihood of some sort of conflict, that they had, whether if there was no conflict, they still had to be prepared. I think that's a reasonable assumption. And so he moved with all due dispatch to prepare the Confederate government for conflict, armed conflict with the North. He had called upon the governors to provide troops to move to other states to serve the national government's interests under leaders from other states, not leaders from their own states. And that was a tremendously tall order. The other thing was, he had to ask for these troops their commitment for 1 to 3 years when they enlisted. Now, many of them had been involved in their local militias, but if you were involved in your local militia for 1 year at a time, that's a different call than being asked to serve in the National Army for 3 years. Right away, all these average yeoman farmers who had families and had to work every day, they had their farms. If their farms weren't taken care of, they go bust and they can't survive. Their families don't survive. Jefferson Davis had to ask for that commitment anyway. And he did. And with the campaign, with the environment, the environment of fear. There's a great book called Crisis of Fear by Stephen Sears. But it's about the secession crisis in South Carolina and the crisis of fear that was created by the newspapers and by the planter class to get the yeoman farmers and those who are poorer than that fearful of slave insurrections, et cetera, et cetera. And that's how they basically got in 1861 with the fear of Lincoln, how they got them essentially to do the initial joining of the armies to be able to be willing to serve. Part of the sales job was that don't worry because this is going to be a quick war and we're going to just have a great time. We're going to march on Washington and then the war will be over before you know it. We'll be back on your farm. Don't worry about it. That worked because there were, as a matter of fact, by March and April of 1861, 200,000 men had volunteered. The problem was that they could only arm and equip just about 100,000. Couldn't even do 100,000. If you had your own weapon, you could come and volunteer for 1 year. If you needed a weapon, you had to volunteer for 3 years. And so probably about 2/3 of the initial Confederate Army was 1 year enlistees who brought their own weapon. They could arm themselves. The others had government-issued weapons and could essentially needed that help. So that was the basis with which the armies were originally brought in. Okay. The economy. We'll talk about that in the next probably 2 in more detail. But they created a national currency. Interestingly, I was reading about New Orleans, and New Orleans, for years before the war, had a mint. U.S. Mint was in New Orleans, and they printed money, coinage, made coins. And it was taken over by the Confederates, by the state of Louisiana, and until April 1862, and then they couldn't really print money in any kind of professional way. And one way that you could tell Confederate fake money, what is that? Counterfeit money was that it was too good. It was too high quality. Real Confederate money was so poorly made that people knew that it was real good. So in any event, that became a huge thing, and the fact is that the Confederate government had a problem in that it had no infrastructure. Think about it. Brand new government, there were no people, it had no employees. All of a sudden, it needs employees, and it has rules and laws, and it's fighting a war, and it has rules that it has to impose on states and on individuals, impressment laws, conscription, and they needed people federal employees to carry out all those jobs. And so over time, the Confederate government not only had a large army, but it had approximately 70,000 employees spread out all over the Confederate States to impose the things like impressment of crops and all that sort of stuff. So it was a massive break from what was, from the reason why those states seceded in the first place, state control. So, but those are the kinds of things that Davis was confronted with. So what did he do? Actually, he didn't ask for Alexander Stephens to be the vice president. Alexander Stephens of Georgia was appointed vice president by that the initial group. He, like Davis, was a collaborationist. He was, one of the last Georgians to go along with secession. He was a brilliant guy. He was a lawyer. And he, once he bought into the Confederate concept, he was all in. He was a very small, diminutive, sickly sort of fellow. He weighed about, 100 pounds. He was, a very small guy. But he was a powerful speaker. He could write. He was extremely influential in the state of Georgia. But he was an opposition leader. He, as much as Jefferson Davis acknowledged, recognized the importance of their federal government taking control. Stephens was just the opposite. He was a states' rights guy through and through. And it didn't take him long. But he, by the middle of 1861, by late 1861, he was so oppositional already to Mr. Davis that he just left Richmond, went back to Georgia, and only occasionally came back to Richmond to work as vice president of the Confederacy. He was a home guy, and he mostly cooperated with Joe Brown, the governor of Georgia, in his oppositional activity to federal control that the government, tried to or had to put forth to maintain the army, the economy, and the food situation for supporting the army. His most famous speech was the Cornerstone speech, which essentially pointed out that the Confederate government was established because the United States government said that all men were created equal. And the Cornerstone speech put that to rest and essentially said that that's not the case and that slavery was, as natural as any state of society could create. He also, I pointed this out before in other classes, but his famous speech basically did not include Maryland, which was a slave state. It did not include Maryland in his future view of the states that should make up the Confederacy. I think he understood that certain slave states, their future was really not as a slave state. He never really came out and said that, but it's pretty clear when you really read beyond just the most heavily quoted aspect of the speech that he understood the reality of the commitment or the lack thereof to slavery, even by some slave states. So Delaware was another one. He did not say that about Virginia, however. And Virginia, of course, being the most populous state in the slave states, that was, even though they had an awful lot of manumission within the state of Virginia, that was not on Stevens' list of states which didn't belong to the Confederacy. And interestingly enough, by 1865, he was back in Richmond a lot, but he was basically representing the Confederate government in peace talks with the Lincoln administration to try to end the war, but still maintain slavery in the old Confederacy. It didn't work out, but that's the point where he was. His main consideration was that the basic requirement of slavery in any civil society in this country. So, and that's fairly typical of what the rest of these men felt as well toward the Confederate government and civil society. As slave owners, large slave owners, that was their way of living. And they would have a hard, very difficult time changing it. That's why I think the history of the Civil War has shown us for the next 150 years or so after Appomattox. But the Treasury Department was another one. The first Treasury Secretary was Christopher Memminger of South Carolina. Interestingly, what Jefferson Davis felt compelled to do was to make certain that in his cabinet, each of the 7 states were represented. It's not like he went for the guy, in a few cases he did, went for the person who was unquestionably qualified to do the job. In the case of Christopher, numerous of these people, he went because the state had to be represented. You had to have every state, voting, in the cabinet or participating in the cabinet. So Christopher Memminger was the first of 3 Confederate Treasury secretaries during the 4 years of the war. 4 years of the existence of the Confederate government. Memminger lasted for 3 years. So he spent a good deal of the time as the treasurer. But they had a problem in that whereas the United States Congress passed a personal tax law near the beginning of the war, the financing, the South couldn't really do that. There's not enough of even the majority economic class of the South, which was the young farmer class, people who owned their own land but not slaves, they were largely independent people. They had no real there were no federal taxes. They were playing back and forth in the state legislature that they were being taxed, and that the slaves of the wealthy class were not being taxed. That was the rub at the state level for a number of years prior to the war. But the fact is that they, as the Treasury Secretary, he and the other cabinet members understood that they could not effectively impose a financial tax, even on the yeoman class, much less the 25% of white Southerners who owned neither slaves nor land. They were completely cash poor. And remember, many of the yeoman class basically used barter to get what they needed. as far as, selling whatever they could of their crops in exchange for implements, farm implements, et cetera. So, and that was why the importance of the market system at the county level, state by state in the Confederacy. Market day, county by county, was, the social and economic lifeline of most yeoman farmers and others. And there was not a lot of cash involved. And so what became apparent to these leaders of the Confederacy right from the outset was that they couldn't depend on average Southerners to be able to put cash up on a regular basis as far as taxes are concerned, to support the Confederate government. They hadn't been doing it to support the federal government in Washington. All of a sudden asking them to do it for the new Confederate government after they had seceded so they could be independent wasn't going to work. So what they had to do and did was create a tax in kind where they would tax the crops that Southern families produce. And that would serve to support the Confederate military. Generally speaking, it worked, but it wasn't very fair because if your farm was nowhere near any battlefield, chances are that you weren't going to be imposed upon by armies. That's what created a lot of bad feelings among people who happened to live near railroads, which were basically avenues with which the army got back and forth to the battlefields. The Confederate soldiers needed to eat, and they needed firewood. And if your farm happened to be too close, you were visited much more often. And they knew it, and they felt it, and it became a major problem. And Memminger had to deal with, he was the guy who really had to deal with, although the rest of the cabinet was also involved. And in Canberra, so was the Confederate House of Representatives and the Confederate Senate. But they had to take the position of the people that they represented. And so they themselves were at first okay, barely okay with it. But as time went on, they became more opposed to it and not supportive of the Davis administration. But Memminger was the man, George Trenholm, another South Carolinian, for a year, and finally, just a cup of coffee, John Ray, Texas. Attorney General was a crucial point because the Attorney General was the administration guy who would fight the battles with us, with the states, the governors of the states, and where Jeff Davis would try to stay away from it. They would create the laws, but it was the Attorney General who was writing the letters back and forth with the governors.
We sure went through a lot of them, didn't we?
Well, it was your basic revolving door, and it was tremendously difficult position. And it had a record of people quitting, and I'm not sure which ones exactly got fired, which ones quit. I think most of them quit. But now, in the case of Judah Benjamin, he was there from February to September of 1861. But you'll find his name in two other places. He was switched by Davis, because he was a very effective administrator. He became the Secretary of War, and also the Secretary of State. And most of the time during the war, he was the Secretary of State of the Confederacy. He was a unique personality. He was from Louisiana. He was born in Barbados or somewhere. He wasn't born in Louisiana. But he was Jewish. And he was the only Jewish person in the cabinet. One of the few Jewish people in the Confederate government, in the national government. And he was, he was not popular, but he was extremely competent at what he did. He was a great attorney. I'm not sure what law school he went to, but I think he was one of the Yale, or I think it was Yale. But he was a tremendous attorney, and he was competent in many ways. He was also a strong nationalist, and Jefferson Davis relied on Benjamin a lot, and he was a confidant of Jefferson Davis because he always seemed to find a way to help Davis get done what he needed to do in the tough issues. So, but you can see Thomas Bragg, North Carolina. I mean, they pretty much came and went. I think one of them was just there for a few months. And yeah, with Keys of Alabama, October of '63 to February of '64. Once 1864 came about, things were really upset. I mean, the handwriting was on the wall. Once the siege of Petersburg and Richmond began, the continuity in the government started to crumble, and not a lot. People started leaving. People started thinking about their futures, not wanting to be seen as part of the revolution. That Benjamin stayed until the very end in different jobs was a great reflection of how much the Confederate government depended on him, despite his unpopularity. One of the really good appointments that Jefferson Davis made was Stephen Mallory of Florida. Stephen Mallory had important jobs in the U.S. government prior to the war, with naval affairs, shipbuilding, and he was very closely involved in the U.S. Navy acquisition of ships and maintenance of ships. And so he was a very good appointee. And so happened that he was the only one from Florida. So that was a double reason for Jeff Davis to appoint him. And he stayed for the whole time. He was there for the whole war. So that was a terrific appointment by Jefferson Davis. Also, John Reagan of Texas, another very good appointee. He had a role. He worked also with the U.S. government in the Postal Department. And his brilliant thing was basically to take the U.S. people who work for the U.S. Postal Service in the southern states and keep them. That's what he did. He kept them and put them to work for the Confederacy. And as good soldiers, they went to work for the Confederate States of America. And the difference that he put into the Confederate Postal Service was that he made it a for-profit organization. So they could profit as opposed to the U.S. Postal Service, which was never to make profit. So what else did he do? Oh, he also, one of the ways he did this was to cut back on the small postal post offices. He centralized things to where there were far fewer employees and far fewer postal offices. And economically, it made a lot of sense. And so that was the secret to what he did. And, he did a terrific job as postmaster. Okay, Secretary of War, crucial position in the Confederate States of America, administration and cabinet. Leroy Walker of Alabama was the first. He was a politician from Alabama. He was a fair to say, a fire eater, and as one of the leading fire eaters, one of the leading politicians from Alabama, he was the representative of Alabama in the initial Confederate cabinet until September of 1861, where his lack of any military background made him not much of a contributor to deal with the issues that they were already facing. And what were they facing in September of 1861? They were already facing manpower shortages, because they knew that by September they had already seen the Battle of Bull Run. They had seen sickness and death, from disease, camps. All of a sudden, the initial idea of marching on Washington there for a couple of, months in the field, that wasn't going to happen. And right away, the people who had already joined, who had to stay home, because they couldn't be armed or equipped, they weren't coming forth anymore. So the manpower was quickly becoming an issue to deal with. And Walker, as much of a fire eater as he may have been, he wasn't the nationalist that was needed in this job. Because the person in this job had to be the guy to help push through the initial conscription legislation. And that was a major turning point in the Confederate enterprise, because that forced men who were all volunteers into being conscripts. And psychologically, that had a major impact on the whole spirit of how Confederates saw themselves. So Walker lasted until September, and that's where Judah Benjamin came in, because he was the guy who said, "Can do, Mr. Davis." And he worked very closely with Davis and the true architect of the conscription law, General Lee. General Lee, at the time of September and late 1861, was not yet the general of the Army of Northern Virginia. He was assistant to Jefferson Davis. He was the in-house general, and it was Davis. It was Lee, and probably is the guy who became his chief of staff in the Army of Northern Virginia, who stayed with him throughout the war, from Maryland, who actually wrote the law, who actually drafted the legislation to create the Conscription Act that the Congress finally passed. I can't think of his name offhand, but I'll remember. But it was under Benjamin that they had to deal with this issue, overwhelming issue of conscription in the South. So March 1862, the time that all that was worked up. Once that was done, Benjamin became the Secretary of State because Robert Toombs resigned. And so he was moved over to the Benjamin was moved over to that, and George Randolph of Virginia, one of the old line Virginia tidewater planter families, became the Secretary.
Oh,
Yes.
have we moved out of Montgomery? Are we now in?
Oh, yes, I'm sorry. Well, yeah, I mean, I'm just going over the cabinet. I'm trying not to do this, you know.
But certain ones are associated with the time in Richmond, right?
Right, exactly. See, and right, there was nobody from Virginia at the very beginning because Virginia was not part of the Confederacy. But once they were in, then, you know, you have somebody. And that's probably one of the big reasons why Lee became the key military aide to Jefferson Davis from the point, right from the moment that he took in office. When Lee resigned his commission, what did he do? He swore his allegiance not to the Confederacy, but to the state of Virginia. I would argue that it was Lee was quietly, fighting for the state of Virginia throughout the war than the Confederacy, because he really didn't show very much interest in what was going on in the Western theater, and rejected, fought as hard as he could to not have to send any of his corps or troops elsewhere, and otherwise continued to fight to get a lot of the state troops to be assigned to the Army of Northern Virginia, especially prior to the Gettysburg campaign, which he did denude a lot of backwater fortresses to build up his army as much as he possibly could before he invaded Pennsylvania. But George Randolph is an interesting guy, and it was Randolph who apparently did have something of a military background. I don't know exactly what it was, but he did have a military background. And he became very frustrated with Davis because Davis had, the issue that he absolutely wanted to control every appointment of every general and field grade officer, and had to himself approve every single appointment that came up around the Confederacy. And George Randolph came to realize that he was a secretary. He was not the Secretary of War, just a secretary of Jefferson Davis. Right? He argued with Davis for a while, but then he just resigned. And that's when James Seddon, also of Virginia, took the job in November of 1862 and kept it through 1865. And James Seddon was the guy who did an extremely good job as the tremendously difficult job of, you could imagine, a Secretary of War for the Confederate States of America under Jefferson Davis. Seddon was really good, and he did the best job of cooperating and working with Robert E. Lee to deal with the issues of supply, of logistics, and supply of the Army, and of men and material. And so Seddon was the guy who would do the best job as Secretary of War. Okay. Timing's not bad today, I expect.
So Seddon had to work with the governors and the states in order to make sure this wasn't a part of the issue of conscripting soldiers, and were they supposed to support the new government, or were they supposed to protect their home area,
Right.
all that?
And that was, an integral part. By 1862, by April 1862, the Union had already taken New Orleans in Louisiana. And there was no protection for the Confederates in the state of Louisiana. Because all those Louisiana Tigers, they were fighting in Pennsylvania and at Antietam in 1862, not protecting the state of Louisiana. So it became, problematic. Georgia, I mean, probably the worst governor, the most, difficult governor was Joe Brown of Georgia. Governor Brown, reacting in late 1861 or early 1862 to the conscription thing, was inalterably opposed. And essentially, when he had one of the conscription areas that you could get a deferment was for state officers of the state of whatever state it was. And so what Joe Brown did was created offices for 10,000 second lieutenants in the Army of Georgia. He deferred 10,000 men in the state of Georgia just to keep them from being conscripted into the Confederate Army.
Did you get away with it?
For a while. But finally, the Supreme Court of Georgia, over the opposition of Toombs and Alexander Stephens and Governor Brown, the Supreme Court said, no, you can't stop that and allow for the Georgia troops to be used to participate in conscription and become part of the Confederate Army. Although he did have what was called Joe Brown's Army. It's a book, I have the book, where there were probably 40,000 men. From the beginning of the war, there were sections of Georgia, I'm talking about this in the class, sections of different states where slavery was really a non-entity, a non-factor, and where people were not willing to risk their lives to go fight a war, and especially to go to other areas to fight a war to protect something that they had no interest in. Well, what they did throughout this especially in the northwestern portion of the state, was to refuse to. They would join the army, but not cross the state line of Georgia. So Joe Brown had Joe Brown's army at one point were 40,000 men who were part of Georgia's army. And when Sherman in 1864 started with this incursion in northwest Georgia, these men called to arms. They became part of the Army of Tennessee, Confederate Army of Tennessee, fighting against Sherman. But it took that point to get these people to join the Confederate cause and not the Georgia cause. And of course, they had other areas too. I mean, they had coastal Georgia. Savannah was under siege. In 1862, Fort Pulaski at the mouth of the Savannah River was destroyed and occupied by the southern South Atlantic coastal flotilla of the U.S. Navy, and occupied by U.S. Army and Navy troops and midshipmen to block Confederate shipping at the mouth of the Savannah River. So they had other issues. They all had important issues that they felt like they had to protect their state. So it was said, and the Secretary of War, that as Secretary of War, he did as much as he possibly could to cooperate, get as much as they could possibly accomplish to strengthen the Confederate Army at the cost of local support. Secretary of State Robert Toombs of Georgia was the first Secretary of State. Toombs was one of the major competitors in the discussion prior to Jefferson Davis's selection as president, to be president. Toombs was a true leader, a hardcore fire-eating secessionist right from the outset, and not on the same team with Alexander Stephens and Joe Brown, for the most part. But Toombs basically was involved for 5 months. In July of 1861, he quit the cabinet and joined the army, and was wounded at Antietam. When the Burnside Bridge, at Antietam. Toombs and this Georgia regiment that was on the hill right behind the bridge that was shooting at all those at all the Burnside's men. So, but he was not a Jeff Davis guy, and he was never happy that Jeff Davis got the appointment. He wasn't the president of the Confederacy. So, with egos like those guys had, that's not too difficult to understand. But he was a Confederate. He did what he had to do. And of course, William Brown, who just a month and again, there's the ever-present Judah Benjamin, who finished the Confederacy as the Secretary of State as well. So he had 3 of the cabinet positions himself over the course of the life of the Confederacy. So that was the Confederate cabinet. Those were the crucial guys who were right there from the beginning, and how it evolved and devolved is really an important lesson in the, I guess, the blood flow. You know how the blood flows through a body? The way the blood flew, moved through the Confederacy, the cabinet and the president were the people who were most closely aligned with controlling the government. The Confederate Senate and House, Lee himself at the end of the war said, "Oh, I've got to go see the Confederate. I got to go see the Confederate House, because all they're good for is chewing tobacco and eating Hoover peanuts." He was bitter with that section of government. He worked well with Seddon, and he worked well with other cabinet members who he had the opportunity to deal with. So,
What's coming up for next meeting?
yeah, we'll say any questions that anybody has. Anybody at home?
Do you think that
Yeah.
high rate of turnover in the academy was due to Davis's personality?
Some of it was, no question about it. Davis failed to get along with an awful lot of people. One of the people whose names, and I've often said that I used to debate people online for many years about what could the Confederacy have done better. Well, I think you see the name John C. Breckinridge as the last Secretary of War of the Confederacy. The guys online were debating who could have done a better job, of president. I think John C. Breckinridge would have been a great president of the Confederacy. He was a former vice president of the United States under Buchanan. He finished up as the Secretary of War, but he wasn't asked, probably, well, not considered, because he was from Kentucky, and Kentucky wasn't part of the Confederacy when Davis was appointed. And Davis had a 6-year term, and he was never, he wasn't going to ever get reelected. But I always felt like, now when I said that, nobody said, "Oh, you're crazy." That would have been a good man, because he was more of a natural leader, and he had a military background as well, and he was a general in the Confederate armies as well. So he also, at the end of the war, very significantly, when Lee had surrendered April 9th, 1865, Joe Johnston still had his army in North Carolina. Breckinridge happened to be with Joe Johnston in North Carolina, and when Jefferson Davis gave Joe Johnston the order not to surrender, but to disperse his troops and bring as many cavalry as he could down to Georgia, continue the war. Johnson, who didn't like Davis one bit, said, didn't want to do it. And it was Breckinridge who agreed with him and gave him a little back so that Johnson disobeyed a direct order from the President of the Confederacy and surrendered in North Carolina. And that really, I'm sure, did an awful lot of good to keep to bring the country, start to bring the country back together again in April of 1865. Just a little aside. So that was the Confederate cabinet. Next time we'll talk about Congress and get into some of the issues that they all had to deal with in more detail.
Are you going to bring peanuts?
Everybody can bring their own little
When Jefferson Davis was elected in 1860, was it a popular election?
No, just he was appointed by the initial representatives of the 7 Confederate states. They did.
And so maybe the war ended in April of 65.
Yes.
And some continued to serve until May of 65.
Right. Davis did not surrender. He was finally captured in Georgia, Irwinville, Georgia, in May 10th, 1865. And from his standpoint, that war was still going on. And he did not surrender until he was literally captured. And his orders to Joe Johnson in North Carolina reflected that. In the meantime, Nathan Bedford Forrest surrendered his cavalry organization in Mississippi a couple of weeks after Appomattox. A couple of other, fairly significant, 10,000 men Confederate organizations surrendered after that as well. They surrendered on their own. And across the Mississippi, that general surrendered on his own as well, because there was virtually no communication.
That's what I was wondering. How long did it take to get the word around about Appomattox?
Weeks and weeks. And especially to cross Mississippi, because there was virtually no communication after Pittsburgh was taken over. Okay, any other questions? Okay, see you next week. Thank you very much.